Other than theocracy, were there other rabbinic authorities who suggested that other forms of government would be viable,
yes,
as viable as monarchy? Or?
And some did actually view it from a both political science point of view and a theological point of view. One of the great theoreticians of monarchy at the end of the Middle Ages and early modern times was himself a great politician, Isaac Abarbanel, leader of Spanish Jewry at the time of the 1492 expulsion.
An advisor to the
And
king,
advisor to
or?
three kings,
Okay.
King Alfonso V in Portugal, and then briefly to Ferdinand and Isabel in Spain, and eventually to King Fernando of Aragon in Naples, where he landed after the Jews were expelled from Spain. And he tackles some of the interpretive challenges in this passage in Deuteronomy, because it is a peculiarity of that passage that it doesn't simply say you should appoint a king. It says that you'll ask to appoint a king like all of the nations. One should add that there's this well-known passage in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 8, where when the Israelites do seek a king, the prophet is none too pleased by that fact. And so interpreters had to try to reconcile this apparent requirement that there be a king with the fact that the Israelites were roundly condemned by God's prophet for asking for a king, and then the peculiarity that the commandment seems to be couched in a peculiar way where we don't find any other commandments so styled that you'll do this because that's what the Gentiles do. And so Barbanel comes along and he argues both on rational grounds that monarchy is not a superior form of government, contra Aristotle, but that in addition, it's not a requirement of Jewish law that a monarch be appointed. It's simply the case, as he reads the passage in Deuteronomy, that if you are going to appoint a king, it must be a fellow Israelite. That is the commandment. He goes so far as to compare it, a somewhat radical observation, to a later passage in Deuteronomy which speaks of the captive woman when Israelites go out to battle. And it's understood that soldiers are in unusual and sometimes trying circumstances. There is a permission given to take Gentile captive women. There's a process involved which she can be brought into one's family, as it were. But it's understood in rabbinic literature that this is not an ideal circumstance. It's a disreputable choice, but nonetheless one that's understandable given the soldiers' circumstances. Barbanel says the same thing about kingship, that this was a concession that allowed for the possibility that a king might be appointed, but didn't require that.
Does he project this idea onto the Messianic times? I mean, it sounds like he's highlighting the fact that it's a conditional commandment. If you get into the situation, fine, you can appoint a king, fine, you can do that.
Yes, it's in the nature of his argument that he would be perturbed to find that the Messiah would be a king. And he interestingly resolves a very problematic rabbinic dictum that had troubled Jews greatly for reasons that will be apparent. A statement of a Rabbi Hillel, not the more famous Hillel, lived around the time of Jesus, but a later Babylonian sage, who said that Israel has no Messiah because the Messiah has already been consumed in the days of Hezekiah. Well, this was a difficult idea to digest among medieval Jews, not least because this is something Christians were often telling Jews. You have no Messiah, you missed your chance. It could be very demoralizing to hear that a Talmudic sage had so said. So there's a whole history of interpretation surrounding this particular text. But Barbanel's very creative interpretation is that Israel will not have a Melech HaMashiach. They will not have a king Messiah. That is to say that the person who will rule over them in Messianic times will be only a Nasi. He bases this on a verse in the book of Ezekiel. What exactly the distinction entails is none too clear, and he does say that the Messiah will be a king vis-a-vis the Gentiles. But as I say, it's in the nature of Barbanel's argument that he should not be aspiring to see a king Messiah, and so he manages to tackle this rabbinic text in a way that points in the direction of someone who enjoys less than a royal status.
But is this an example of a biblical interpretation which departs from the normative halacha, the normative Jewish law? In biblical interpretation, there always has been a license to approach the verses with originality, creativity, and insight, even if it doesn't necessarily conform with the strict Jewish law as it has been handed down. Because every interpretation has points of truth to it. But the codified law of the Talmud is that appointing a king is a positive commandment.
Well, my recollection is there's an argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Naharoi Maimonides, who really is the only one who speaks to the issue, because of course most Jewish legal authorities didn't discuss matters messianic, it being beyond their purview. They restricted themselves to issues that were salient in their own times. Or really, when we speak about codified Jewish law, I think we're essentially speaking about Maimonides, perhaps others. He was certainly the weighty authority behind this choice in favor of kingship.
Especially in these issues. I don't know if does anybody else discuss halachically kingship as a real halachic issue.
It's a fantastic idea that Maimonides felt compelled to rule on these issues. There's no halachic decisor before or after felt the obligation to codify the laws that were not in practice in his own time.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, that's why.
Yeah, but Maimonides saw his mission as not just a guide to practice, but a codification of the entire body of the law, and therefore he dealt with the sacrifices, he dealt with the laws of kings and so on and so forth. So you're right. But as a consequence of the fact that he's the only one, there's almost a presumption of authority.
I guess so, although I think one would have to, I would note two things. One is that I think that Rav Perlo, in his commentary on Rasag Sefer Mitzvot, actually raises the challenge that the normal, here Rabbi Breitowitz will have to speak with authority in a way that I can't, but the normal way of deciding an argument between Rabbi Yehud and Rabbi Naharoi would be in favor of Rabbi Naharoi. So in this case, since he's the one who sees that it's to the discredit of Israel that they would opt for this choice, it's actually a bit perplexing why Maimonides opts for monarchy, and I think there's a theological issue there that goes beyond straight Talmudic exegesis. He was very nervous about the notion of pure theocracy with God as king, and so he felt it important to be in a governmental system where there was some human authority, albeit he doesn't advocate absolute monarchy. There are some strict limits. Limits on the king. So I think one has to think about the larger sort of theological picture. And Barbanel undoubtedly may have had his own personal reasons for finding kings distasteful. After all, he and all of Spanish Jewry were expelled by a king and a queen. In addition to sort of issues of exegesis and law, there are sort of larger historical and political, sometimes theological forces at play when these issues get discussed.
I'm not clear on what the disagreement here, where would this disagreement take place? Is it on the level of halacha? Is it a matter of putting Maimonides on the one hand and say the Barbanel on the other hand and saying, well, how are we going to decide? Or is it just, what we call hashkafa, right? Philosophically, what is an ideal system? Because for us, halacha, I would think, is more binding than philosophical differences.
Well, there's a presumption that if the Torah would prescribe a system of government, philosophically, it would be the ideal. We wouldn't expect that the ideal would be not to have a king, but the Torah would say, nevertheless, appoint a king. We have to assume that if this is the system of government which the Torah prescribes, that would be the ideal. So if we have a philosophical challenge, right, that forces us to review the issue. In other words, is it possible to, on the basis of the philosophical aspects, conclude that perhaps the normative halacha should follow the opinion, which is that this is not a positive commandment. But you're right. It's very dangerous. We certainly don't apply that methodology as a rule. As we try to approach the texts, we do accept authority. It's just that here there's not a lot to go hard evidence.
I think Michael does raise an interesting point, though, which is that if we ask ourselves realistically how people might feel about the prospect, of a Messiah coming tomorrow in the form of royal government, it goes without saying that a large segment, certainly the overwhelming majority of world Jewry, has long given up on traditional messianic expectations. I suspect this one as well. 19th century reformers, of course, had a little use for a rebuilt temple and in gathering of exiles. They saw themselves as German Jews of the Mosaic procession, so on and so forth. They doubt that they would have welcomed the notion of a king Messiah. It would be an interesting question to think about the Orthodox segment of world Jewry today, who does pray for a king Messiah on a regular basis, daily basis, and how that jives with the fact that Jews have become quite used to, and I would say happily used to, living in one or another form of liberal democracy, whether it be in the modern state of Israel or in the various diasporas that Jews inhabit.
I think it'd be a lot harder things to get used to.
What, then a
Giving up
Messiah
our
king?
homes, giving up our businesses, moving to Israel. And the Messianic age is not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know if the form of government is going to be the real problem.
I guess we have to also, countenance the notion that, there are monarchs and there are monarchs, and while we worry about the absolutism that monarchy may allow for, and tyranny, in fact, to which it